Hello, and welcome to the Other Minds podcast. I'm Joseph Bohegan. You're listening to the music of David Tudor, the subject of today's interview with composers inside electronics. Other Minds, founded in 1992 in San Francisco by Charles Amarkanian and Jim Newman, is devoted to championing the most original voices in new and experimental music. On Season 5 of the podcast, we're talking with a range of composers, performers, and authors across the field of new music, including the featured composers from the 30th Other Minds Festival, which will take place October 8th to 11th, 2026, at the Brava Theater in San Francisco. Today I'm joined by the members of Composers Inside Electronics, a group of composer-performers dedicated to the composition and live collaborative performance of electronic and electroacoustic music. The group was formed in 1973 by David Tudor and is known for its pioneering use of original live electronics, including custom-built software instruments, resonant sculptural instruments, rotating and focused loudspeaker systems, and ultrasonic instruments. On June 26th and 27th, 2026, Composers Inside Electronics will perform music by David Tudor for the composer's centenary with Other Minds and Mills Performing Arts at Littlefield Concert Hall at Mills College at Northeastern University in Oakland, California. So, welcome to the podcast, everyone. Since there are so many of you, let's have each of you say your name and your relationship with David Tudor or the influence he's had on you as a musician.
I'm John Driscoll and started working with David back in 1973 in Chicago, and been part of CIE since, officially CIE started in 76.
Hi, I'm Phil Edelstein. I met David slightly before Jacoroa, must have been late 71 or 72, when he was doing a performance at a university and came through with the Cunningham Company. But really, it was that apocryphal moment at New Music, New Hampshire, where I met John and took David's workshop that sort of set me on this lifelong path with David and John and many of you others.
My name is John Bischoff. I was initially drawn to Tudor's work after hearing his version of Cage's Variations 2, released on Columbia Records. Just really knocked my socks off. And I basically decided to do electronic music from that point on. And then I had the good fortune to work with David in 1973 at Mills College when he was doing a recording project of his piece, Microphone.
I'm Paul DeMarinis. I met David at Mills in the early 70s. John and I, it must have been when he was through there, maybe for that recording or maybe with the Cunningham Company in 72 or something. And then I started working with Composers Inside Electronics in 1976 with the Musée Galliera presentations in Paris, and did some other stuff after that too.
I'm James Fay. I have never had the good fortune to work with David Tudor, but I did see him perform towards the end of his life with the Cunningham Company in New York. But like John, that recording of Variations 2 was a formative experience, and it really kind of got me interested in his work and to investigate and try to find out as much as I can. When I was at Wesleyan for my master's, I had opportunity to learn more about how he worked, which was kind of a difficult thing to find out about at that point, and I've been kind of fascinated with him since.
I'm Michael Johnson. I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and yes, I never met Tudor either, but was introduced to his music on college radio in the mid-'80s, I suppose, through the Lovely recordings, and got very interested in a lot of spaces between the arts and started building electronics myself and sort of trying to find a way to focus on feedback in music, always with his work in mind because it was exemplary, I thought, in sort of taking feedback and turning it into a really productive idea instead of a kind of a demonstration or something. And then over time, was lucky enough to meet not just some of the people in this group, but also gained access to the instrument collection at Wesleyan through the extreme generosity of Ron Quivola. And because of my skills in electronics, began to study the instruments directly, and that's been a huge focus of mine, is actually understanding the instruments in a very intimate way and bringing some rigor to an understanding of the music through the instruments, and then rebuilding them and playing pieces, learning more about how the work works by actually playing with original instruments or clones of original instruments.
So Phil and John D, you both mentioned that early experience in New Hampshire performing Tudor's Rainforest 4. Can you talk about the process of realizing that as a collective?
So maybe start with the setting for, there's an extraordinary group that came together for what was known as New Music in New Hampshire. Peter Kotek, the composer and performer, was largely one of the motivating forces to organize it. To give you a sense of the substance of this and how it bound us all together, is the principals there were Gordon Muma, David Tudor, David Berriman, Julius Eastman, Frederick Jeffsky. I'll say that John and I were kind of in our, I'll say, early 20s at that point, and really quite absorbent. David comes and, in his very quiet way, explains a little bit the process of Rainforest. And at that point, it had been a piece done for the Cunningham Company with small transduced objects with contact mics, basically where as accompaniment or a piece to go with the eponymous piece by Merce Cunningham, Rainforest. Basically, it was the original version was these small objects just kind of in the orchestra pit. David didn't bother telling us that these are small objects, and with our interest and curiosity about sound and space and the sponges that we were, we quickly kind of scaled up, understood the process pretty quickly. And, at that point, the launching point was this freedom to discover, to take a resonant object, find its resonant characteristic through various means, find a material that would bring that object to life, and then figure out how to perform that kind of in an ensemble setting, which became Rainforest 4 coming out of that workshop. John, maybe you want to add a couple of anecdotes on that.
I actually had run into Gordon Muma a bit before that because I had wanted to rebuild the modulator that he had built for the Pepsi Pavilion, because I was interested in combining sound and sculpture. And so Gordon had suggested that I come to Shikarawa for the workshops, and said that David Behrman was also going to be doing circuit building workshops. And I really had no idea how to build circuits at that point, so that intrigued me. David was working in this attic space in an old farmhouse, and I was actually heading to the workshop with David Behrman and looked in this dark room, and hanging from the rafter there was a plastic garden sprinkler, the one that has like the fans that go up, and also a little cast iron ring. And it was just going, rah, rah, rah. And I looked in and I went, that's it. That's where sound and sculpture meet. So for me, it was a very simple next step, which was to work with David on the Rainforest project. My background was in sculpture primarily, and a little bit in puppeteering. And I had a desire to, with the objects, to build more, I would call them sort of compound objects. That wasn't just one particular found object, but one that was created with different characteristics and multiple objects combined. I had the good fortune of spending a number of years living next door to David in Stony Point. And during that time, we collaborated quite a bit doing the early Rainforest projects, both as a group, and sometimes David and I would go out to universities and do it as a workshop as well.
I've seen lots of pictures of performances of this, installation performance piece where people are touching the instruments, going inside resonant objects. They always look like they're having a lot of fun. So this can be for any of you. What are you noticing when you see people experiencing a piece like this for the first time?
So for me, what evolved in those early years is the clarity of the look of listening. One of the fascinations of the piece, as the composer performer, you're putting out the sound field, and it's an invitation essentially for the audience to explore the sounds, the tactility of the objects, and the social interaction that happens. So, there's these wonderful images you see of that look of listening where all of a sudden the gaze goes internally, and then you can actually see in that act of looking and listening the transition between observation and listening. The social interaction is first with the other audience members, which is, what is this guy hearing? And then in the performance of the work, you're looking for ways of satisfying or giving material to the audience to listen to.
The object making a sound is like the first point of attention, I think, that people get, and it's an entree into the piece. And one thing that I really love for myself and watching other people get it is if you've hung out there a while, and especially when things are kind of winding down, that all of a sudden you really hear the sound cloud in Rainforest 4. You hear this translation of those sounds coming over the speakers in a way that makes this halo around the whole piece. And I've watched people like that dawn on other people, this whole organism. Usually it's like in the last, bringing it into a settling point. For me, that's a really magical moment.
There was two young kids that came when we were doing it in Philadelphia. It was a school group, actually. And David always made a point of, he wanted us to always invite children and in particular the blind. And so there were these two kids, and I had this sort of old gourd with these fishing poles coming out of it. And there's this marvelous image of these two kids with their ears plugged, biting on these fishing pole rods. And just literally the sound transduced into your teeth. And what was remarkable is the one boy, literally, I'm probably not exaggerating, was literally biting on that fishing pole for almost 40 minutes straight. And his teacher came up as they were leaving, and she said, I don't understand it. He has no attention span in school. And it made me realize that, he didn't have the right input, I think in hindsight now that time has passed, I realized that whole process of the group of us in a changing group, it wasn't always the same people. Over that period, I realized that it was a collaborative work. David had that concept, but the reality is the Rainforest Fours, if you look at the history and the photographs and videos, etc., every one was completely distinct in terms of the sound materials, the objects, how it was suspended, etc. So in a way, it created a new medium. It was really a performed installation, so to speak. I think in some ways, looking backwards, it helped define a new medium.
Let's listen to an excerpt of David Tudor's Forest Speech, performed by composers inside electronics at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. What kind of direction did you get from Tudor in order to perform these pieces? Are there all these wonderful charts that I've seen, and are you getting any instruction from him?
Well, Ralph Jones put it, I think, very succinctly. He said, the only thing David ever told us was where the best restaurants were. But literally, there was no explanation, so to speak. I mean, for instance, that diagram of rainforest was after the fact. That didn't exist until well into 76 or later.
I do remember hearing David say to someone in San Diego, maybe a student there, no composed music.
Yeah, I think that was probably the instruction.
I'm curious about the instruments that you're using in these performances, especially about the future of the performance of this repertoire, especially as technology continues to change and some things disappear. So are you trying to keep the instruments exactly as they were when they were created as sort of period instruments, or are you adapting them to use contemporary technologies but get the same sounds or different sounds?
Well, I think for these performances, Michael, for instance, is using, well, Michael, you can talk about what you're doing.
Well, and I want to ask a specific question to Michael because I read in the notes for Pulsars that it will be on, quote, accurate recreations of the original instruments. So when you're determining the accuracy of these recreations, what are you trying to stay faithful to? Is it the objects, the sounds that are produced, something else?
Well, my perspective on the feedback pieces, which I think is maybe quite a bit different from Rainforest, is that if you're going to understand the feedback pieces, you have to go back to the instruments, because the feedback pieces are born out of the instruments, not out of an idea, really. And so my approach has been to study the instruments directly and find out exactly in electronic terms and engineering terms what they are and how they function, and then clone them exactly as much as possible. Not try to port them into another world or mimic their sounds, but discover how their sounds were born out of the instruments that made them, because the work was made in collaboration with the instruments. The feedback work was made very much in collaboration with the instruments, which is to say, the instruments presented ideas about sounds through their own existence, through their own nature, to which he responded, made some ideas about how he would connect them, and that loop regenerated itself. And so my approach has always been, and continues to be, to go back to the instruments themselves and just simply remake them. And in doing so, I learn about how the piece actually functions, how it was actually born, and you find an awful lot of the sounds. Not just the sounds, but the moves, some of the transitions between things, some of the, I call them like hinges, where the piece sort of bends or changes direction or has a point of flexibility. And that simply is not possible any other way. If you take it as your goal that you're going to mimic the sounds of a piece, then you're making a simulation of it. You're not really making the piece. The piece itself is the feedback pieces. I keep prefacing it by saying the feedback pieces, they are electronics. They embody electronics. They're not ideas about electronics. They are. And so anything else to me, I don't learn anything. You know, I could ask an AI to simulate David Tudor's music. I don't see the point of it. The more I understand about the instruments is because I enter his world, not because I superimpose mine on top of it. And one of the nice things about analog electronics is that it needn't be ported to the future in some other technology. It is simple enough that it has a high likelihood of surviving.
Michael, I'm kind of curious in the process of working through pulsars, as someone really interested in the kind of electronic feedback we're talking about. How was the process of recreating the piece? Did you find that as you replicated the instruments, it did that?
Yes, it does the pulsar stuff. The thing is that, let's put it this way, the instruments tell you a lot more than the scores do a lot of the time. So a part of the trick is, on some level, from an engineering perspective, it's not that hard, although it's taken me a very long time to figure out the instruments and recreate them accurately. But the more difficult part is taking the patch diagram, deciding that you've got the right instruments, and then all the things that aren't said in the score, which are how big a role does this part play in the piece? What are the knob settings? What are the gain settings? In feedback, all that's hyper important. The parts of the path that are relatively unimportant, the parts that are crucial, those tiny, where the hinges are essentially in the playing of the piece. And those do reveal themselves over time, and they are not anywhere in the score diagrams or the patch diagrams or whatever you want to call them. If you put the right instruments together and the right connections, you start to hear some of the characters of pulsars. You hear that little thing that it does. And I don't know how I would find those things otherwise.
I'm very excited about what you say, Michael, about the idea of these hinges. I mean, that's a good word. I think rather than the specific sounds, more that the way sounds change or interact and transition from one to the other is really, it's hard to define, but more what characterizes Tudor's pieces, and it's, of course, like you're saying, it's that character is born in the material nature of each piece and the resources that he's employed and how they're connected together. I think that's true of certainly of the Variations 2 version he did, and I think it's true of Microphone, my experience of him performing Microphone. The thing that keeps baffling my mind about Tudor's example is that, he defines these bounded spaces that have almost infinite richness, infinite degree of surprise in their actual performance. And it's really hard to get that.
And that's what makes them so damn hard to play in a way.
Well, there's this wonderful thing about harnessing chaos. These are basically chaotic oscillators. And David had this mastery of being able to essentially explore the edges and the dimensions of these chaotic systems. Chaos is structural, not emotional. I mean, this was, how do you perform complexity beyond harmony, if you will, right? It's its own distinct musical form. I'll put the proposition out there, right? And it's this ability to find the nature of these complex systems and then find the edges and essentially explore, as the performer, you're exploring those edges. As the composer, you're creating the opportunity for those. And then in the performance, you're essentially, how do these things manifest at the moment?
Let's listen to an excerpt of David Tudor's Pulsars, performed by Michael Johnson. John, Bischoff, and James, you're performing a piece that also uses the resonant spaces of the hall as instruments. Could you talk about that? And maybe, John, you could also talk about the recording that you made with Tudor and Blue Jean Tyranny at Mills College in 1973.
So this was a piece that was originally done at the Pepsi Pavilion, right? And it was one of the many pieces, including Pepsilator, that he he kind of felt like it was lost because he made a lot of pieces for Osaka because he was the main musical director for the kind of music programming and all the planning that went into it, which it's a pavilion that was sponsored by Pepsi, that was done with EAT, that basically infamously ran for maybe a month before they shut it down. They were 3 times over budget. So he built all these pieces that were unique to the space, which was in a kind of 3/4 geodesic dome. Had a unique sound system. I can't remember now, 32 speakers, something like that.
37.
Close. And had that console that Gordon designed that had modulators on every channel. So microphone was a piece for that particular situation. And it is one of the few pieces that he revived, after Osaka. And he did it at Mills, where John and I taught. So the way he did it at Mills, at least as much as we can infer, is a little different because it was not the same setup, it was not the same kind of space, but it was done in the kind of staircase, this resonant staircase hallway at the Center for Contemporary Music. So when this concert was being planned, it seemed like a good time to revisit that piece in the space that Tudor had done it in after Osaka.
John, could you say something about that recording?
Yeah, well, that's a good description, James. And my memory of doing the recording in '73, very vivid memory of he was doing a multi-track recording of the piece. And so, as I remember, he had just one feedback chain running from the recording studio booth all the way with mic and speaker lines and running all the way down the hallway to the stairwell. And in that chain was the Muma modulators. And then I think there was a phase shifter I was playing. And also these very steep, high Q Ling filters, very narrow band filters. What I can still picture is David preparing for each sound, each complex sound. I didn't know what was on the Muma box, but he was setting knobs on the Muma box without hearing anything, just setting knobs, kind of getting ready. And then he would open up the gains, kind of slowly open up the gains. And this incredible, beautiful beast of a sound would come out. And it was a surprise, obviously. He didn't know exactly what it was going to sound like at the onset. As it went, he might tweak the knobs to kind of change the kind of resonant distribution of the sounds that were happening. And then he would slowly shut it down. There'd be a tail on it. And then he'd wait maybe a minute and then he'd do another one. So it was this very slow process with lots of space, with these just incredibly gorgeous, surprising, unique sonic events, complex events that were happening. And of course, I would change the knobs on the phase shifter, try to have my little bit of influence. But it was so amazing how this defined situation that he was then interacting with in this indeterminate way, it was just amazing, completely unique. And each of the sounds seemed to me to be unique. But to have a character that was born out of the whole configuration.
Yeah, I mean, microphone was an odd piece in his output because it's, as far as I can think of, the sparsest piece in his whole catalog, because he did a lot with microphonic feedback, and I mean, Variations 2, which we talked about, had a lot of contact mic feedback and goes back to cartridge music. But I think that might be the later pieces that Michael was describing, they're all electronic feedback, right, within the circuitry of devices. But this was kind of might be the last of the microphonic feedback pieces, but it's kind of notably sparse for Tudor. And when you hear the recording, it was released on Cramps, which was an Italian label. So it was one of the few pieces that was available. And the recording, I think one side was 6 takes overlaid, the other side was 3 takes overlaid, and it's still very sparse. So it was very, very unusual.
Let's listen to an excerpt of David Tudor's Microphone.
I think one of the elements that is rarely, explored with David's works and discussions is, obviously feedback was essential. In fact, the beauty of this program is that except for forest speech, all the pieces are feedback pieces in one way or another. But the side that I entered into with David because of spending a lot of time with him and touring with him often was that his fascination also was with the acoustic properties of a space that these pieces were performed in. And as Paul mentioned, we did a rainforest in Buffalo, and we put the speakers up at the top of this atrium. And David comes in, he goes, the cloud. The cloud is marvelous, And, later I would be modifying all these sound around panners for him in different configurations. And I think he had an equal interest in how to take these, materials and put them in a space using the resonant properties of the space. For instance, it's rare that when he would do a setup, that the speakers would be aiming towards the people in the audience. He always loved to have one at least aiming back and up. And so I think there needs to be sort of a look, because also later on, I forget the year now, Martin Calv and Ralph Jones, myself and David did a research residency at the Media Study in Buffalo with the specific purpose of working on directional speakers with focused sound and moving speakers. In fact, we had drawings of talking, discussions of, well, how could we spin people with speakers? So I think there was always an interest in David of the space and the movement of the sound in the space, as well as that generative character. And really the resonance of rainforest, that concept of resonance, just carried over into the other pieces in terms of the resonance of the spaces.
One of the other really essential aspects, and it's a kind of modern term, but where's the human in the loop? One of the things that we're all quite cognizant of is what's the action of the performer? So while there's automation involved, there's this focus on the judgment and the human interaction that brings the work to life. I think that's an important thing also. And especially as we get into the modern AI challenges, this idea of what is the performer really doing and what are they listening to and reacting to, and how do they bring that to the audience, I think is a really critical part of these feedback pieces.
You'll also be performing one piece that's not by Tudor on the Saturday program, which is John Driscoll's 2018 piece, Speaking in Tongues. Are the instruments that you built for this piece growing out of the tradition of Tudor's instruments? You see a continuity there?
Oh, absolutely. They're basically ultrasonic acoustic feedback. Just the fact that you can't hear them directly is not material, because in fact that they have the same character of all these variabilities of thresholds and characteristics that are unique to the different instruments. I think that in a way brings some of the feedback into a current situation, though ironically I did a very early version of that work called It's in Them and It's Just Gotta Come Out. I had these, they look like just TV remote controllers that we'll actually be using. And David and I had a performance together of dialects and then this It's in Them piece. And because of being a puppeteer, I used to roll around on these low stools, manipulating puppets above. And so I said, David, would you be okay with performing with me on a rolling stool? And he said, oh, great. So you can imagine David scooting around on this rolling stool with this remote controller. And the remote controller would really sort of tune these instruments into a range. And much like his feedback, where it just jumps at a certain point, if you saturate the feedback with this controller, so he would just roll up an object, and he had this gesture where he'd just, and push the button, and all of a sudden things would explode. And so I felt it's appropriate to this chain of feedback pieces, and the delight that he had actually in exploring feedback, not by a piece of his.
Let's listen to an excerpt of John Driscoll's Speaking in Tongues. Since this concert is happening in the year of Tudor's centenary, what do you think he would make of the musical world that he helped create?
I'm not going to touch that one.
No, I think he'd delight in the fact that, one, there's been a desire to perpetuate his work. I don't think he ever took these works that literally. A lot of these works had evolutions. There were numerous iterations of them. I go back to the idea that we discovered with Rainforest, that David had these concepts that were very fundamental. And then they would have permutations, variations with dialects at this Marymount College. He hands me the score and he says, well, here's what we'll be doing. And, like Michael, I go, well, David, I don't have those boxes. He says, no, don't worry. Just do it your way. Well, that in a way opened up a dimension to me. And maybe it was just because of physically being with him that he really wanted you to explore the concept of the piece and left it to you, much like with Rainforest, of, well, how do you then execute that? And I think really the perpetuation of not only us, but other students and other composers who have been intrigued with this work, my guess is tons of people have been inspired by these different works. I sure was,
You can hear composers inside electronics perform the music of David Tudor at Mavericks 250 on Friday and Saturday, June 26th and 27th, 2026, at Littlefields Concert Hall, Mills College at Northeastern University in Oakland, California. We'll be back in a few weeks with an interview with pianist Stephen Seek on the music of the late 18th century American composer Alexander Reinagel. Thank you to the members of Composers Inside Electronics for joining me today, and thanks everyone for listening. This has been an episode of the Other Minds podcast, brought to you by Other Minds. Our 30th festival is October 8th to 11th, 2026 at the Brava Theater in San Francisco.